Spring 1983. For nearly 10 years, General Augusto Pinochet has ruled Chile unchallenged.
We needed someone to dare to say to the dictator that he was a dictator, and to say that the dictatorship was a dictatorship, and confront it on its own turf. Not on the turf of arms, just to dare to tell them that what we had in Chile was wrong, and that it had to be changed.
Pinochet came to power in a 1973 coup that left the elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, dead.
During the first months of the military regime, the number of people detained in prisons reached more than 40,000. At least 3,000 individuals were assassinated, executed, or their bodies disappeared forever.
Ruthlessly eliminating any challenge to his authority, Pinochet's rule cast fear into every corner of Chilean life.
It was a very permeating paranoia, and it was with everyone. Everybody had experienced some sort of oppression in their family, and they were very cautious. My husband and I would go to a social gathering, and he wouldn't introduce me to anyone. And I said, well, why won't you introduce me to people? And he said, oh, we don't do that now. It's too dangerous. You don't really want to know people's names.
Fear, terror. If you have people afraid, you can control them. And Pinochet, if something he will leave in history, he's the man of terror.
Executions, disappearances, and prisons keep the dictatorship in power for 10 years. By 1983, a severe economic crisis has pushed unemployment to 30%. As Chileans feel they have nothing left to lose, open opposition to the regime becomes thinkable for the first time. The first signs of opposition appear at the heart of Chile's economy, in the copper mines of the Andes Mountains. Miners are amongst Chile's best paid workers in the country's largest and most lucrative export industry. Their leader is 29-year-old Rodolfo Seguel, a payroll clerk at Chile's largest copper mine, recently elected president of the National Labor Congress. Seguel wants his members to take the first step, a nationwide strike.
10 years had gone by and nobody had gone out into the street. We had to see what reaction the country would have, and then to see if the country would dare to do this. Our goal was to open people's eyes and to tell them, we can do it. It is possible. We can do this.
A week before the strike is to begin, Pinochet's troops surround the copper mines. Seguel knows that there will be bloodshed if the strike goes forward. They change their plans. Instead of a strike, they proclaim a national day of protest. With only a few days to prepare, they must mobilize not just union members, but the whole population.
I remember that morning. At the beginning, you didn't know if someone was walking slowly, driving his car slowly, or walking slowly on the sidewalk, because he was just taking a walk or because they were protesting. Until finally at noon, It was so obvious. It was so obvious that everything was slower. It was so evident that the city started to close down.
As darkness falls, no one knows whether the final overt act of protest will succeed. At exactly 8 p.m. it begins, tentatively at first.
And the next day, there was a sense of sort of, what did you do last night? Did you see it? Oh yes, I was out banging my pots and pans with my neighbors. And so there was a real sense of complicity all of a sudden in a society where each human being had literally become a complete island.
Y el día siguiente que termina la protesta,
And the next day, when the protest finished, at the first meeting that we had, we decided to have a protest every month. And we did that during 9 or 10 months. Every month a protest. And that was chaos for the military regime, because we didn't protest with arms. That gave us more power.
A mood approaching euphoria grows as the protests grow every month. People start to believe that mass demonstrations alone will bring down the dictatorship. Mainstream opposition protests are strictly non-violent. Brutal police repression of the monthly demonstrations seems intended to intimidate, to stop the movement. But it has no effect. In early August, one day before the fourth protest is scheduled, Pinochet installs a new interior minister, Sergio Harpa. Harpa is instructed to begin a dialogue with the opposition. In a contradictory gesture on the same day, Pinochet deploys thousands of troops in the streets of the capital. An ominous prelude to the next day's demonstrations. Security forces break up the August protest with unprecedented force. A police statement admits that 17 civilians have been killed. The actual number is much higher.
que fue muy violento.
It was very violent, and that's when I realized that we couldn't keep on going down this road. Because the violence was too strong. Pinochet had 16,000 soldiers on the streets of Santiago. More than 80 people were killed, and the population started to rebel.
Shocked by the bloodshed, the new Cardinal of Chile's Catholic Church offers to host the dialogue that Pinochet has promised.
At the first meeting, Gabriel Valdez told me that he had to give me a document. And I told him that I would not take this document because it is an agreement that you drew up this morning, demanding the resignation of the President of the Republic. That you don't recognize him as being legitimate. And if the President of the Republic is not the legitimate president, I have nothing to do here, because I represent him. So this is where it all ends, right here.
Buenos días.
As Pinochet celebrates his birthday in November, he has stopped Sergio Harpa's meetings with the opposition. Harpa's small concessions Limited political activity, the return of exiles, an end to book censorship were too much for the general. The dialogue is over.
No hubo ningún resultado.
No, there wasn't any result. It was very
No
frustrating.
cambió para nada el régimen. Y
The regime didn't change at all,
el propio Harpa después
and Harpa himself was left there as a politician with no importance.
de ninguna importancia, diría. De
In
hecho,
fact, the control of the government passed on to much harder hands.
Opposition groups have been naive to think that Pinochet would negotiate an end to his own power. Protesters have not loosened the dictator's grip, but they have shown Pinochet they cannot be crushed by force, and they have opened up political space they will use to organize against him.
¡Viva Chile!
In late November 1985, 500,000 attend the largest political rally in Chilean history. Gabriel Valdez speaks for 11 opposition parties and the Catholic Church. The National Accord, formed to lead a non-violent transition to democracy. Valdez warns, if we don't support the National Accord, we are heading towards civil war. In Chile's poor neighborhoods, the poblaciones, a low-intensity war has already begun. Hard times have fallen hardest here, making fertile ground for Chile's Marxist and Communist parties. Not many have personally taken up arms, but the ideology of violent revolution is accepted. The regime sees the poblaciones as enemy territory. Young men in the poblaciones are rounded up, interrogated in stadiums and fields, and hauled off to prison without trial. Hundreds are never seen again. Pinochet's human rights abuses have drawn the normally conservative Catholic Church into the conflict. Though the clergy takes no political position, the Church protests against the torture, killings, and disappearances, and preaches non-violent methods.
If you use violence, then you have to have the force to defend yourself. Whatever you impose through violence, you have to defend through violence. That's why we think that violence is the strength of the weak, because they don't have arguments, they don't have moral authority. So whatever you achieve through violence, you have to defend through violence.
Monthly protests turn violent as the radicals confront police, handing Pinochet the excuse he needs to come down on all opposition. Mainstream factions are harshly criticized for their non-violent methods.
In those conditions, when you are repressed by violence, of course there are people that think that the only way to face violence is through violence. But that was, in our understanding, absolutely out of any possibility of succeeding.
In late summer of 1986, the prospect of full-scale civil war becomes real. Chilean intelligence uncovers a cache of arms in the northern desert and traces them to a guerrilla group affiliated with the Chilean Communist Party. Markings show the weapons have come from Cuba. Pinochet says it's proof that his opponents are preparing a revolution. A few weeks later, heavily armed guerrillas attacked General Pinochet's motorcade on a remote mountain road. State news media report that 5 presidential guards have died, but do not mention Pinochet. Four hours later, the dictator appears on television to describe the attack. He appears unfazed by his narrow escape. and returned to the presidential palace with his customary swagger. The episode reinforces his image of invincibility.
It really polarized, I think, between, are we going to go for a really serious attempt at armed struggle, the way we've seen in Central America, with a huge toll on human lives and suffering that was part of that? Or are we going to try to find some other way, which was very nebulous, and so this search began to find some way that could provide some kind of an exit from this impasse.
Pinochet's own constitution calls for a plebiscite in 1988, giving Chileans the right to vote yes or no to another 8 years of military government. Isolated and overconfident, Pinochet always assumed he would win. But after 5 years of organizing, the non-violent opposition sees an opportunity.
For the first time, we knew that if Pinochet was going to remain in power, there's going to be a plebiscite, and you have to say yes or no. Therefore, we say, look, if we prepare ourselves, we can defeat Pinochet saying no.
And we said, how are we going to trust the dictator that has been doing all these things, and he will count the votes, that he count the votes as the votes are? But we realized that we had no other way, and we said, let's move ahead in that direction, and let's create all the conditions to avoid any fraud.
Thousands of volunteers take to the countryside in a door-to-door campaign to convince Chileans that they can vote no without fear of reprisal, and that the results will not be rigged. They are greeted with suspicion and skepticism. To create the appearance of a fair vote, Pinochet and the generals write new election laws. Any opposition party that can collect 35,000 signatures will be allowed to have poll watchers, a critical factor to prevent vote fraud, and be given 15 minutes of television time every night for 4 weeks before the voting.
And I said, look, if you register, I'm going to be on TV. And the day that I'm going to be in TV, I will say to Mr. Pinochet that he has to go.
Primero dijo, usted, General Pinochet.
After his party is certified, Lagos gets his chance when he appears on the Chilean equivalent of Meet the Press.
Le voy a recordar, General Pinochet.
He holds up a newspaper clipping in which Pinochet is quoted saying he will not be a candidate in the plebiscite.
Y ahora le promete al país otros 8 años, con tortura, con asesinatos, con violación de derechos humanos. Me parece inadmisible que un chileno tenga tanta ambición de poder de pretender estar 25 años en el poder.
His daring performance makes Ricardo Lagos a celebrity overnight, and his performance foreshadows the significance of television in the coming No campaign. Pinochet's vulnerability is human rights. The No campaign plans television spots to emphasize torture, death, and prison. But US political consultants advise them that dwelling on the fears of the past would be a turnoff.
They developed a campaign that was future-oriented, a campaign that focused on bread-and-butter issues, and it was a campaign that ultimately caught the Pinochet regime and the supporters of the yes vote by complete surprise when it was aired on the first night in that last 30 days of the campaign.
Porque nace el arco iris después de la tempestad, porque quiero que florezcan mil maneras de pensar, porque sin la dictadura la alegría va a llegar, porque pienso en el futuro, voy a decir que no.
That no, what was meaning yes to democracy was meaning yes to more social justice and not no to injustice.
And la alegría ya viene, meaning joy is around the corner. It was an invitation to a country that belonged to everyone. The idea that we were going to defeat the dictatorship, not with a gun, but a pencil. That this road was going to be traveled without hate, without rancor, without vengeance.
On television, the No campaign is a sensation. Images of a bright future without Pinochet. The TV spots earn credibility with skeptical viewers, with compelling references to the suffering inflicted by the dictatorship.
People used to rush home to watch those spots. I used to rush home to watch those spots. It was like, 15 minutes where, they use real words to say real things, Torture is torture, and it happened here. And after all these years of denial, there it was for the first time on television. Poverty exists.
Buenos días, Don Aníbal. Deme 2 marraquetas.
Little old ladies don't even have enough money in their purses to buy a tea bag for their afternoon tea.
Voy a llevar té también.
¿Cómo no? 2 bolsitas.
Una nomás.
No más miseria.
La información de este minuto para el diario de Cooperativa dice que a muy pocas horas de que se inicie el plebiscito en Chile, voto no. No. Voto sí. Sí. No.
Opposition poll watchers now perform a parallel vote count based on sampling techniques. By fax and telephone, the numbers are fed to computers in Santiago. By early evening, they project the no has won decisively. A small independent radio station announces the results. Ensconced in the presidential palace, Pinochet says nothing. Suspicions of electoral fraud grow as hours pass with no announcement of the vote tally. At midnight, Pinochet's Navy, Air Force and police commanders enter the palace. General Fernando Matei, Air Force commander, tells reporters, it appears the no has won. A public statement that warns Pinochet to accept the defeat. Within seconds, his remarks are on the radio.
The great strength was that it did really come from ordinary, extraordinary people. And they really did put their lives on the line, and they really did come out, and they really were willing to take a stand.
I think that we in the world, we really live on power. And what we would like to is to live on authority, personal authority, moral authority. When you act based on power, well, if I have a gun pointed at me, I'm going to say whatever you think and you want. After you take your gun off my head, I'm going to do what I want.
How people lived that moment. And they lived it without hatred, convinced that they had been the participants, the actors.
Aquí no hubo un líder carismático.
Here there was no charismatic leader, no guerrilla, no vanguard that would say, I did this. The sense in Chile that night was that they had done it themselves. How many? 7 million.
Major funding for this series was provided by Susan and Perry Lerner. Additional funding was provided by the Albert Einstein Institution, advancing the study of strategic nonviolent action in conflicts throughout the world. Elizabeth and John H. Van Merkenstein III, Abby and Alan Levy, and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations.